My name is Barbara Humphreys. I'm a member of the Together Women Rise Book Club Committee, and I'm going to be one of the moderators for this evening's program, along with a fellow committee member, Vicki Bush-Joseph. Before we get started, we're going to have a lot of people joining us today, so here are a few Zoom instructions that will ensure everyone enjoys today's program. Please stay muted at all times during the presentation. The chat feature can be used. Please enter where you're calling from, and this is the location where we'll share links, questions, discussion items. There's a grid icon, upper right-hand corner, little dots, which if you click on, will switch between speaker view and gallery view. Most of the time you'll want to be in speaker view, but when we get into our breakout groups, you'll want gallery so that you can actually see the people that you're interacting with. We've got members in attendance tonight. We have members, we have guests, and others who may be completely new to Together Women Rise. And we want you to know that all are welcome. We're glad to have you with us. Together Women Rise is a powerful community of women and allies dedicated to achieving global gender equality. We have hundreds of local chapters across the US where members learn about gender equality issues, give grants to organizations that empower women and girls in low-income countries, and build community to forge meaningful connections with each other and with women and girls around the world. Our book club is another way to engage our mission, to learn about global gender equality issues and to experience community with others who care about making the world a better place for women and girls. For more information on our book club and how to get involved with Together Women Rise, please visit our website at togetherwomenrise.org. Tonight, we are discussing the book, The Night Watchman by Louise Erdrich. First, we'll hear from our guest speaker, and then we'll break into small groups to discuss the book. Please be sure to stay until the end of the call for our traditional book giveaway. The Night Watchman tells the story of the author's grandfather, who was a tribal leader of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa and an organizer and activist who fought against the termination of nation-to-nation treaties by the US government. In light of the book's themes and the mission of Together Women Rise, we looked for someone who could talk about the current situation for indigenous women here in the US and the challenges they face. We are thrilled to have our special guest speaker tonight. At this point, I'm going to turn the program over to another member of the book club committee, Wesley Howell, who will introduce our guest speaker. Wesley?
Thank you. Good evening. It is absolutely my pleasure to be able to introduce Chris Stark. Chris is Anishinaabe and Cherokee. She's an award-winning writer, researcher, visual artist, national and international speaker. Her second novel, Carnival Lights, is a Minnesota Book Awards finalist. Her first novel, Nichols, A Tale of Disassociation, was a Lambda Literary finalist. Her essays, poems, academic writing, and creative nonfiction have appeared in numerous publications, and her poem, Mama's Song, was recorded by Fred Ho and the Afro-Asian Music Ensemble as a double CD. Chris is also a co-editor of Not for Sale, Feminists Resisting Prostitution and Pornography, and a co-author of the groundbreaking research, Garden of Truth, the Prostitution and Trafficking of Native Women in Minnesota. I believe she gave us a link to that in the chat. Her writing has been nominated twice for a Pushcart Prize. In 2012, she was named a Changemaker by the Women's Press and was a Loft Series Mentor finalist. In 2019, she received the International Social Justice Citizen Award from the International Leadership Institute.
Thank you. I don't know how to do that. That's awful. That's a very.
Chris has appeared in numerous media, spoken at law schools, conferences, rallies, and 4 times, I love this, 4 times at the United Nations. She's taught writing and humanities courses at universities and community colleges for 20 years and has worked as a Two-Spirit program director at Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. Currently, she's the inaugural visiting research fellow at Villanova Law's Institute to Address Commercial Sexual Exploitation, where she's sorry about that, too many S's, where she is conducting research on the history of colonization, slavery, and sex trafficking of Indigenous women and girls. She also consults with a variety of local and national organizations and teaches writing at a community college. She's a member of the Minnesota Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Task Force. Welcome, Chris.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks to everyone who's spending their evening with us to talk about these really important issues. Buju, my Indian name is Nagamo Zibi Onse Ekwe, and my English name is Chris Stark.
Okay.
And I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. That actually kind of relates to the first question that we had for you. So as a person of Anishinaabe and Cherokee heritage, what is your preferred terminology for that heritage? We hear Native American, we hear Indigenous. Are there other terms?
You know, I as a writer, I use them interchangeably, and so that's fine with me. I don't particularly have like one term that I want people to use.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. In both The Night Watchman and in your book, Carnival Lights, there are many references to ancestors from the past and to elders who try to carry on some of the old ways in the present. Could you tell us a little bit, and please talk about the importance of older generations to Indigenous people and the significance of passing along traditions?
Yeah, so the concept of ancestors I can't obviously speak to all 500 plus Native tribes in what we now call North America. But the importance is rooted in different belief systems around time and around what happens when people die. And those are cultural values, and they're rooted in more of a sense of continuation, or perhaps like a circle versus just a linear progression towards things will be better down the road. We will continue on in these ways and things will get better. And so in our ways, when we think about healing, I would think of my healing as being connected to my ancestors. And I believe that my healing, in fact, helps my ancestors who have already passed, from this lifetime, and that connection doesn't end upon death, and that it's a continual, very vibrant and very real connection. So that's a very different, of course, idea of death compared to other other belief systems. But thinking about the passing on of traditions is like any culture, certainly quote unquote American culture, there's many ways that we pass traditions along as quote unquote Americans. And for, Native people, because of what my Wet'en called the attempted genocide, because Native people are still here, it becomes just that much more important, because many Indigenous cultures have been completely exterminated from Turtle Island, what we now call North America, Central America, and from other land masses, globally. And so when you have a way of life and a culture that in many ways is on the brink of being lost, carrying on those traditions, particularly language, is crucial. So one of the things that we have going on in the Anishinaabe community in Minnesota and Wisconsin is we have language immersion schools, and it's like a community-wide celebration when we hear about someone's, young baby whose first language is now Anishinaabe,
Wow.
Anishinaabe Moen, or kids in elementary school or junior high school who are learning their state certified lessons in Anishinaabe Moen. So that's a huge victory for all of us. It's like a celebration for all of us. And that language piece is one of the most important ways that we pass on traditions in our cultures and create that, maintain that connection with our ancestors and the ways that we believe the Creator gave us to be in the world.
Wow. Thank you. Moving in, I don't even know how to make this segue. Intergenerational trauma is a common theme in your book and in the Night Watchman. Can you explain the term intergenerational trauma to those who might not be familiar with it? And can you talk a little bit about it as it applies to Indigenous people today?
Yeah, so probably some people have become familiar with the idea of, like maybe sexual violence or domestic violence, aspects of that being passed on from one generation to the next. And then we have epigenetics, which is a belief that has been talked about in Native communities, in African-American communities, and in Jewish cultures as well, where we have, again, it's that idea of having those connections with your ancestors and having those kinds of cultural assaults as well, being passed down from one generation to another. And then, sort of quote unquote Western science, stepped in with epigenetics and is like, oh yeah, like we can actually see, that there's been like a change on the DNA strand from this particular trauma from, 2 generations ago or 3 generations ago or whatever. So in the Native communities, we have the historical trauma, which is of course an ongoing trauma. It's a contemporary trauma as well, of colonization and racism. And then central to, in my opinion, central to colonization, the attempted genocide of Indigenous people, is sexual violence and what we call domestic violence or physical violence against a partner. And we can look at Christopher Columbus. I know I'm kind of going a little bit over into another one of your questions.
Yeah,
but
keep going, yeah.
we can look at Christopher Columbus's journals and see where they're talking about the profound brutality and torture, outright torture, that the Spanish conquistadors inflicted on the Indigenous people in Central America, and then of course came up, into what we now call the Southwestern United States, cutting off hands if they didn't bring back enough gold. They talk about raping women and how much the women would fight back, and then they subdued them, and they go into some detail about that kind of brutality. But in those journals, Columbus also talks about how the Spaniards were going out and searching for 9 and 10-year-old Indigenous girls that they would then sell in what we now call sex trafficking, sell to be raped. And so when we look at the history of at the very beginning of the colonization of Indigenous people on Turtle Island, we see at the center of that is this profound violence directed against Indigenous women and girls. And, that is something that is passed down in a variety of ways, where, like studies show that, high percentage rate of Native people daily think about their loss of language, the loss of land, the distrust for white people, the distrust for white systems, and so on. And so that those, centuries of trauma continue in our minds today, and we're reminded of them. And then on top of that as well, you also have, very high rates of sexual violence and domestic violence being committed against Indigenous women or Native women and girls and boys as well, and Two-Spirit people. And so then on top of the, that cultural, loss and trauma, then you also have the ever-present intergenerational passing down of trauma, passing down of sexual violence, which doesn't mean that that someone is going out and committing rape against someone else because they were raped. That's not what it means. But there's so many different ways that unresolved trauma from sexual violence gets passed down or impacts the next generation. You can have someone who has been, raped repeatedly as a child, and they might have some issues with dissociation or anxiety or depression or whatever. And then, that in turn impacts their ability to be present and to be fully themselves for their own children.
And as part of Together Women Rise's mission, when we look at the mission of achieving global gender equality for women and girls, we have looked at sex trafficking in other countries. And I think some of us might be surprised the prevalence of sex trafficking here in our own country. And can you talk a little bit about what is going on today? How Indigenous women are continue to be exploited in this way?
Yeah, absolutely. So Native women are disproportionately used and many would argue targeted by pimps, by sex traffickers. And those are all rooted in historical reasons, some of which I talked about, I touched on a little bit. And you can, like I said, you can look at Christopher Columbus and you can see the impact that had on Indigenous communities. But then when the colonies, were established, prostitution and sex trafficking was central to that because that was central to European cultures. And that was part of European cultures, and they brought that over here with them and created them. And especially upon first contact, when the Europeans first landed here, there were not very many European women. And so Indigenous women and girls then were the fodder for much of that organized sexual violence in the very beginning. And there was a belief system, Manifest Destiny was part of that. And there was a belief system, you can find it in their journals, where these European men are talking about Indigenous people, and often specifically Indigenous women, as being agents of the devil, that they're not human, they're subhuman, they're like wild animals, they have to be subdued. And then the word squaw has, many argue or believe that it has connotations, and it actually means prostitute. Like that's the word that they were using to talk about Native women, was prostitutes. And so that became, institutionalized, but it also became a fabric of the myths and the stories of what we now call, quote unquote, US, or, some people use the term American culture. And so those things haven't died and gone away. And we talk a lot about intergenerational trauma, historical trauma in communities of color. But one of the things that really needs to be discussed as well and analyzed is is historical predation too hard a term? I'm actually trying to figure something else, but how is it that then in white communities, those ideas, those racist and sexist ideas, and that actual violence is not just an idea, but that there are, particularly white men who are acting upon those ideas and who know they can get away with it because of jurisdictional issues, because Native people and women are primarily invisible in this culture, and so on. So we also have to spend some time thinking about what about that? What about that being passed down intergenerationally, in European, or what we now might call white communities, and what can people in those communities do to change that?
I'm imagining then some of that, when you talked about jurisdictional issues, I was like, oh yeah. You're a member of the Minnesota Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force. And so I'm imagining that some of that touches on the work of the task force. Can you tell us about that and what some of the goals are and how you're accomplishing them?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually the task force has now ended, but it was a very successful event in 18 months, much of it during COVID. We managed to have meetings, and we managed to meet with community members and other stakeholders to write a report. And I put that in the chat in the very beginning. If you scroll back to the very beginning, you'll see I listed the MMIW task force report, and then Garden of Truth, and then also an article I wrote called Strategies to Restore Justice for Sex Trafficked Native Women. And so you can go through and read that, but just to sort of quote some of those statistics to give it a little bit of context, our report: American Indian women and girls make up 1% of the state population. And from 2010 through 2018, 8% of all murdered women and girls in Minnesota were American Indian. And from 27 to 54 American Indian women and girls in Minnesota were missing in any given month from 2012 to 2020. And so the report goes on to identify root causes: colonialism, racism, sexual objectification of Indigenous women and girls, and then also talk about risk factors for Indigenous women and girls to become murdered and missing Indigenous women, child welfare system involvement, domestic violence, incarceration, prostitution, trafficking. And then it also touches upon demand through the internet, through extractive industries like the mining, and then entertainment, hotels, casinos, sporting events, and so on. And so I don't want to, spend a whole, I don't, want to necessarily spend a whole lot of time talking about that. Folks can go and look at that. But some of the factors that affect if, when, and how MMIW are found and serve justice: investigation is often never even happens if the family members or friends even report a person missing, because a lot of times Native people won't go to the police or other systems because of, again, essentially intergenerational trauma, basically, with those systems, and because those systems are often unresponsive or re-victimizing. And then, low prosecution and sentencing. And one of the arguments that I make in my article, Strategies to Restore Justice for Sex Trafficked Native Women, is the importance of pursuing civil litigation for people who have been prostituted or sex trafficked, but particularly for Native women because of the differing jurisdictional issues. For instance, in the Native community, the district attorney is the one who decides whether or not a case will be brought forward to be prosecuted. And 62% of the crimes that involved sexual violence are denied. So the other piece to that is, again, very few, in my experiences, Native women will even go to the system at all. So these statistics are also based upon kind of a sea of people not interacting with the system at all, because they're like, it's not going to do anything, or it's going to make it worse. And some other things that are crucial are data systems. We have a real paucity of data, and then also, as I mentioned earlier, an invisibility factor. So low public awareness. Oftentimes that Native people even exist. When we did the Garden of Truth, the prostitution and trafficking of Native women, we interviewed 105 Native women in Minnesota who were in prostitution or trafficking. And one of the women told us that a trick, a white man who bought her, said to her, I thought we killed all of you. So, you know, a lot of those genocidal attitudes and beliefs are still all too present in people's minds and thinking and then behaviors.
Wow. Do you have, I'm not sure if success story is the right word, but do you have a change story, an impact story that you could share with us about a single woman or a group of women or legislative change or an impact of your work?
Yeah, so what happened with the MMIW task force is that we now have the first and only MMIR, so that's murdered and missing Indigenous relatives, because we actually have a lot of boys and men that go missing as well in the Native community. So we have, like I said, the first and only MMIR office. It's legislatively mandated by the state, and it is pretty new. So I don't have a lot of information to report on that, but you know, that was out of our 18 months of work. And then the work that it took for Mary Kunish, who's a state representative, she's a Dakota woman. She's the one who created the task force in the first place. So we actually have Mary Kunish, we have Peggy Flanagan is our lieutenant governor. She's Anishinaabe. There's a couple of Anishinaabe women in Cloquet, which is up on a reservation, who are in the city council, you know, and I'm forgetting people too. But I mean, we have, you know, many success stories. You know, the reason why this information is coming out about MMIW, and of course, in the case of like the Garden of Truth, you know, is because of generations of Native women who have, almost all of us have experienced usually multiple forms of violence throughout our lifetime, have found ways to survive that, to live with that, hopefully to do some healing around it, and to work to help our communities address these issues that are now, you know, embedded in our community. And, you know, one more thing I want to add there too is that in, you know, African American, white, Asian, Native communities, Latina communities, the perpetrators for each of those groups of women primarily come from their same racial backgrounds or cultures. But for Native American women, our primary perpetrators are white men. So that is, you know, one difference from all others. And again, you know, we can trace that right back to colonization, what I was talking about with, you know, the word squaw. There's still over 1,000 topographies in the United States that have the word squaw in it, Squaw, Tit, Peak, etc. So it has this sort of like funny invisibility, yet it's so deeply embedded, and it might be shocking to people listening to this that there would be someone who would say, you know, as he's purchasing a battered woman, I thought we killed all of you. But there's a lot of that, unfortunately, or far too much of it. And it really is harming, and has harmed and continues to harm our communities.
Thank you so much for sharing the strategies document, because I think when we think about education being the first step, you know, just becoming an awareness being the first step, is there anything else that you could recommend for women who want to become allies in this issue?
Yeah, I can tell you a great, I'll try to be brief, a great story. You know, and I could have shared many more stories.
Oh,
with
yeah.
you know, I mean,
I think we have a ton of questions from the chat for you as well. So there you
okay,
go.
yeah. So there's a lot more, you know, stories that I could have told you, but basically the foundation for the information that's coming forward now is all created pretty much out of Native women who have survived all different kinds of violence. We're the ones who are driving this work, you know, we're the ones who are really doing it. But like you said, we have to have our allies, and we're all in this together. We're all human beings together here on this planet, and so we want to help each other in good ways as well, right? Not just that we get help, but also that Native people and Native cultures have tremendous value, gifts, knowledge, and insight, and so we have ways that we can help others as well. For instance, Anishinaabe Moen is one of the most difficult languages to learn in the world because of its complexity. So, we have to really always be working against that Hollywood idea of like the Native person standing there going, how, right? But anyway, so a quick story. My friend Babette Sandman up in Duluth, Minnesota, she's always talking about how much we need our allies and we need to be working together. And they just created a Chief Buffalo mural. They created a park, the indigenous community up there worked with the Duluth government to create a Chief Buffalo park. And then they created this beautiful Chief Buffalo mural. And Chief Buffalo was one of the Anishinaabe leaders up in that Duluth area. And so finally, the Anishinaabe community and Chief Buffalo specifically, is being recognized and is being reintegrated into then the Duluth community up there. So that's working against that invisibility and against that attitude of worthlessness that U.S. culture conveys about Indigenous people and Indigenous cultures. So, we really need those allies. And I'm always kind of stuck when people ask me, well, what can we do? Yeah. Because there's so many things that can be done. And I don't know any of you, so I can't, I don't know how specific I can be. But like, however however you're living your life, like I'm a teacher. And so if I want to, help bring visibility to the Hmong community, I'm going to have a section on Hmong literature, and we're going to read, a wonderful book by a Hmong writer and talk about, those things to the best of my ability. So whatever it is that you're doing in the world, how can you bring Native people to the table? How can you bring forward the voices of Native people through films, through, history lessons from Native perspectives, from literature, tell other people to read our books. And I think having those one-on-one conversations with people is also really crucial, like the LGBT movement, right? One of the things that we were always saying was, sit down with, your family and talk about these issues and talk about them honestly and have open conversations. And so I think that that's also really crucial. But, we've seen a tremendous amount of movement in our immersion schools and developing our immersion schools and the work around MMIR, MMIW issues here in Minnesota, in part because we have Native women who are in political office now at all levels. And that's just crucial, like Deb Haaland, with, at the federal level. So that's really crucial. So whatever it is that you're doing, how can you plug into, you're not going to save someone, you're not going to really necessarily so much help someone. Mm-hmm. You're going to start working towards bringing forward, cultures and people and allowing us to be present.
Yes, sure.
And educating ourselves and then speaking up when we see those stereotypes and challenging those stereotypes. Are there Indigenous authors that you'd recommend? You talked about, reading books that give us the Native perspective. Any books or authors that you would recommend for us?
Yeah, of course, I love Louise Erdrich. I live, I think, a couple of miles from her bookstore, so I can run down there. I see her around. And Susan Power, she's a Dakota writer. She's fantastic. She's got a new book coming out about boarding schools. And so also, I just want to say also that boarding school, the graves that are being found in the boarding schools, and that sort of hitting the national media is just crucial, right? Because we've been living with this for so long. And now all of a sudden there's this, beginning awareness of what was institutionalized murder and starvation, medical experimentation, rape, other forms of sexual violence, including outright sex trafficking. So, that kind of thing is just really important too. If you're in the media to help us get our voices out there is really crucial. But Susan Powers, a fantastic author, and Reservation Dogs, I think that's on HBO. Yeah, that's like a great entry into some Native cultures. But there's the Troyer brothers, Tony Troyer and David Troyer. They're both Anishinaabe. I guess I'm a little partial to Anishinaabe authors. But there's just so many good books. Another one of my favorite ones is the Turquoise Ledge. It's really a beautiful book, and it often reminds me of being in ceremony. So, healing from these atrocities is, it's not a given, but it's most certainly possible. And many of us have done that. And we've many of us have done that through our own cultural learning, relearning or learning and practicing our cultural traditions and our ceremonies, which were outlawed by the United States government until 1978. So until 1978, it was illegal to practice any Native ceremonies or religions in the United States of America. So those re-emergence of those cultural ways, I know they saved my life for sure. And I know many other people who would say the same thing. So there's a lot of really powerful, positive things happening in Native communities. And we have the intergenerational trauma, the historical trauma from the attempted genocide, but we also have intergenerational culture. Our cultures are still alive, and we have intergenerational love. And it's that intergenerational love that is proving to be stronger than the trauma.
Beautiful. Beautiful. That is mic drop. I think Wendy has collected a bunch of questions from folks in the chat. So I'm gonna go ahead and toss it back over to her. And
thanks, Wesley. Yes, there are some questions in the chat, and if anybody wants to add their own questions, please do so. And Chris, I've also been trying to keep up with your recommendations in the chat for people as well. So hopefully that's helpful. First question we have is, do tribal communities welcome back sex trafficked girls and women, or do they experience rejection if they return? This is something that we certainly have seen in other countries where we funded sex trafficking projects, and wondering, what the situation is here in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that there's no one answer on that. And there's certainly been a significant amount of stigma and shame that has stuck to Native women who have been prostituted and trafficked. And that is also true for some or much of our community. But that has really started to change here in Minnesota. And we had an event up in Duluth maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and we all just brought food like we always do. And then we played a short movie, and then we had some traditional healers there, and we talked about these issues. And then the traditional healers led a little healing ceremony for anyone who had been harmed in those ways. And so that was a profoundly honoring experience for those who had been hurt in those ways. And I was there, and I did not feel any of that sort of negativity or those negative attitudes in the community. So because it has profoundly impacted the Native community, and that stigma and shame is there to, maybe sometimes it's pretty heavy and sometimes maybe there's more of an understanding of you're trapped in that kind of situation. There's a lot of potential for cultural healing around that at the same time.
Great. Another question we have, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the immersion schools that you were referring to try and get the language going back into your community.
Yeah, so those were based on some immersion language schools that were created in Hawaii, and then in South Dakota with the Dakota, and then in Wisconsin and in northern Minnesota, we have these language immersion schools. And if you were looking to, if somebody was looking to give some grants or something like that, those schools could really use some financial help, because they're incorporating the Ojibwe language or the Dakota language into the everyday lessons, so that the children are often learning the lessons in the Ojibwe language once they're ready to do that. And that means that you have a small group of people that are responsible for like all aspects of a school: administration, curriculum, teaching, FIAT, and so on. And they even have had challenges with finding books sometimes, because it hasn't been that long that books are now being published in Ojibwe and in Dakota, but there's not very many of them, and it hasn't been going on very long. So there's a lot of challenges to starting these and maintaining these immersion schools, that we don't think of in terms of like a well-established educational system like we have in the mainstream culture. But those immersion schools are crucial because they're incorporating those traditional ways, those traditional values, and you might go out and do berry picking as part of a daily lesson, and then learn from an elder who tells you all of the stories around berry picking and the values around that. So they're wonderful, just wonderful experiences for our young people. And those of us who are older celebrate right alongside with those children.
Awesome, thank you. Are you talking about schools? Are you aware of any public schools in the US that are teaching children about the historical treatment of Native Americans in the US? Kind of not just the Christopher Columbus story that that so many of us learned in school.
Yeah, I know that there's some schools here in Minnesota who are doing that, and for sure we have tribal community colleges, and those are great institutions as well, really important, and they're teaching that kind of history. But I know that there are some high school teachers and some junior high school teachers who have talked with me about wanting to incorporate carnival lights, into their curriculum to work with their students. But we have all this critical race theory, sort of drama going on and so forth. So I think it's a struggle to do that, but it's obviously crucial to do that, especially now we have Halloween coming up, and then you see the Pocahontases out there, and you see the, cultural appropriation through Halloween costumes, and all of those kinds of things could really, respectfully and appropriately be discussed with, young people and with children. You don't have to tell them the gory, what I mean? Obviously it would be age appropriate, but that's really the place to really do a lot of intervention when they're younger like that, and teach them in age appropriate ways. And then they don't take all of those lies and myths, hook, line, and sinker. They get an alternative to that.
Yes. Well, we've run out of time for our Q&A. I've put in the chat that your latest book is called Carnival Lights, and please everyone hang in after our breakout groups because we're going to give away 3 copies of Chris's latest book, Carnival Lights. And Wesley, I'll turn it back to you to thank our wonderful speaker.
Actually, I think that's part of my job. I'll step
Sorry.
in. Yeah. No worries,
Come on
Wesley.
in, Nikki.
I'm totally fine. I was like looking for the mute button.
No, it's all good. I gotcha. So Chris, thank you so much. When we invited you, didn't know exactly what to expect. This is above and beyond our expectations. Thank you so much for participating with us, for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, your personal experience. And you've given us so much to think about and to talk about. So we definitely appreciate you. We appreciate your time and for sharing so much with us tonight. Thank you very much.
Yeah, miigwech. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
So for those, hopefully everybody will stick around because we've got a few minutes that will split into discussion groups. And even if you haven't read the book, please stick around. This is one of my favorite parts of the evening. We do have a couple of recommended suggested questions that you can talk about with your group, but you don't have to. We'll have a few minutes. Wendy's going to put our groups together for us. As she's doing that, let me tell you what the 2 suggested questions are to talk about. So one, Louise Erdrich concludes in her afterword, quote, lastly, if you should ever doubt that a series of dry words in a government document can shatter hopes and demolish lives, let this book erase that doubt. Conversely, if you should be of the conviction that we are powerless to change those dry words, let this book give you heart. How does this compare to the work of Together Women Rise? And then the other theme or question is, have you ever been a night watchman? Who are the night watchmen in our lives? Literally, Thomas fulfills that role at the factory and in his attempt to stop the termination bill. Indeed, his everyday actions, for example, writing birthday cards, shows how he is watching over his community. So the question there is, have you ever been a night watchman? And who are the night watchmen in our lives? So Wendy's going to put us in our discussion groups, and then we'll rejoin at the end for some final announcements and for our book giveaway for Chris's book, Carnival Lights. So let me finish up this evening, and this is our last book club event for this year, for 2022. Our book club committee is currently planning our next book selections and our meeting dates for next year. If you have any suggestions for us, please email Wendy at togetherwomenrise.org. And then watch our website, the Together Women Rise website, and our newsletter, The Dish, for future events. All of our book selections and the book club events will be posted on the upcoming events and the book club pages under the Join Us tab on our website. We'll also promote them in our monthly newsletter and on our social media. Please join the Rise Goodreads group to continue our discussions and to make book recommendations through Goodreads as well. And then finally, just a quick reminder about our monthly webinars on the first Thursday of each month. Our next webinar will be November 3rd at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be discussing Together Women Rise's project with Authentic Memorial Empowerment Foundation in Cameroon. This project provides conflict-affected young mothers and pregnant girls with access to education, livelihoods, opportunities, and psychosocial support. We will learn more about this project with their executive director, Dr. Margaret Niger-Thomas. All right, so Wendy will now spin our wheel, our prize wheel, to give away 3 copies of our speaker's book. Chris Stark wrote Carnival Lights, which is
My
fictional.
battery's running low.
And so Wendy, go ahead. You don't need to be present to win anymore. All right, we've got Edie. Is Edie on board? Otherwise, we'll just send it to her. That's good. All right, next one. We've got 3 total. Nancy Walden. And then we've got 1 more. Catherine Sullivan Kolar. All right, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for being with us tonight. Look, watch for our announcements for next year. And if you have suggestions for us, please send them along to Wendy. Thanks much. Good night, everybody.